Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, fellow Psych Lifers. I hope everybody's having a great day out there. 7 continents. Today, we're going to do a video on marijuana. We asked, you guys spoke. We got a 92% response saying that you guys wanted us to do a video on cannabis and wanted to know the history behind cannabis, some of the psychological effects that cannabis leads to, what leads people to using cannabis, and lastly, what our overall opinions regarding the drug is. So just let's start off by saying that if you have been enjoying our content, please hit the subscribe button. And while you're watching this video, if you're enjoying this video, don't hesitate and click the like button, all right, to help the algorithm in our channel. So immediately, we're going to start a little bit with the history of cannabis itself. Now, marijuana dates back as early as 5,000 years ago, and maybe we shouldn't use the word marijuana. We should use the word cannabis, because there are many plants that come from cannabis itself. That think of cannabis as the umbrella term, and then there are other faculties or variables that fall under this umbrella. So the perfect example is hemp. Hemp has gone back 10,000 years, as early as 10,000 years, BC, guys, BC, in which hemp has many uses. The reason it's called hemp, though, is because it contains THC levels below 0.3%, while marijuana contains THC levels higher than 0.3%. But let's not get it twisted. Hemp has many uses, thousands and thousands of uses, from making socks, shirts, weapons in the past, obviously, history, your mattress, purses, articles of clothing. They can even be used in the past to hold, like as a rope almost. And there were many industrial reasons why hemp continued to be used throughout histories, and hemp has THC. Okay, but now that we got that out the way, let's move forward, where marijuana can date back as far. Marijuana itself, the plant that contains 0.3% or higher, dates back at least 5,000 years. Much of cannabis history has been tied to many different cultures throughout history. And I'll give you an example. The ancient Egyptians used to use cannabis to treat glaucoma and to treat stomach aches. Now, just so you guys have an understanding, ancient Egyptians go back thousands of years, okay? They were the ones who built the pyramids, obviously. There was a Chinese emperor who called cannabis good for medicinal purposes as far back as 2900 BC, and there's actual writings and proof of this. So cannabis goes way back. They are even speculating that cannabis came about in Central Asia, and that's how it got to these other places like Egypt, which is in Africa, and Europe. And they have even dug up graves of shamans dating back 1,000 years with burnt marijuana seeds. In this case, marijuana, not hemp, marijuana. And this is just an overall history of cannabis. There's a lot of suspicion that it came about in Central Asia. Spiritually, marijuana was used in India often. I mean, they have their god Shiva, who it is said that rested under a marijuana plant after family arguments. Never used the word smoke, just says rested under a marijuana plant after family arguments. And he is considered the Lord of Bang. And ancient scriptures refer to cannabis as a herb to release people from anxiety. Ancient scriptures in India refer to cannabis as a substance to help relieve people from the symptoms of anxiety. So already, we're already talking about thousands of years ago, where there's already a history of cannabis use and cannabis reasons why people are using cannabis. Want more information, if you want, just because we're on the topic of history, in 70 AD, which now we're talking about after Christ, about 1,900 years ago, Roman medical texts show that they were using marijuana to cure ear aches, and Arabians used it from 1800 AD to 1900 AD for migraines, pains, and syphilis, because at the time, and there have been many English documents that show that marijuana had medicinal purposes throughout the after Christ era. especially in Great Britain, that they used it for joint pain, muscle spasms, menstrual cramps, convulsions. And this is important to note because they have been using cannabis throughout history for a variety of forms. Now, when people think about cannabis, they're immediately thinking about its use for mind-altering effects. But really, we already talked about how cannabis is a general umbrella term. And if we were to split it up into marijuana and hemp being below 0.3%, marijuana being higher than 0.3%, hemp is a plant that's been used throughout history. I mean, without it, we don't know how human development would have developed, because hemp had many uses. It wasn't until late. Most cultures didn't use cannabis as a form of medicating. They used cannabis, and specifically the plant hemp, to help their culture survive, and to use it to build accessories like rope, like we talked about, for survival purposes. If you're interested in some American history, in the 1700s, George Washington was interested in farming hemp, but he also questioned the potential medicinal uses of marijuana in his journals. And this is shown in his journals of 1765, where he loved hemp, he loved the plant, and he loved its use in American society to help America prosper. But he wasn't too fond of smoking, despite there is evidence showing that he did smoke hemp. And if we were to even go deeper into American history, Thomas Jefferson has a famous quote that some of you guys may be surprised by, where he even says something along the lines of, "Some of the best moments in my life was sitting in my back porch smoking hemp." So this is obviously a funny quote because many people are aware of this. But marijuana dates really far back. And if we were to look at in the Middle East, when Islam started coming about, they obviously did not accept alcohol consumption from individuals. And what happened? People then eventually started using cannabis instead of marijuana, because the scriptures didn't really talk about exiling cannabis. They only talked about exiling alcohol. So these are some cool facts and history about marijuana. Obviously, if we want to talk about prohibition, I mean, there's been, depending on the cultures, like I said, most cultures did not use marijuana for consumption for that mind-altering effect, but they did use the plant hemp to help their society prosper. Now, those cultures that did use cannabis, let's say, they used it more for spiritual purposes and medicinal purposes. It wasn't that they were using it to just get high just because, and that's important to know moving forward in this video. Now, later on in history, there was obviously, if we talk about within the last 150 years, marijuana became more popular. Obviously, the American government here stopped prohibiting marijuana. I think it was as early as 1937. And then later on, now recently, they've become more open for recreational purpose or medicinal use. First, it started with medicinal use, now it's for recreational purposes in places like California, Colorado. And obviously, it's become destigmatized now. But I feel now, in destigmatizing some of the stigmas that exist with marijuana, there are some new stigmas that have come about. And we're going to get right to that right now. So now that we have the history down, how far back it goes, shamans' graves being dug up, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the Romans, the Spanish colonies, when they colonized here, requiring people to grow hemp. Now that we have all that down, let's talk about the brain in relation to marijuana. Now, a lot of people may not know this, but the brain has millions of cannabinoid receptors. If I was a famous Jewish scientist, right, who was working on cannabis, working on cannabis research in the mid-1900s for Israel. And the Israeli government would give him 8 kilos of marijuana every year to study so they could have some facts about the drug. And what do you know? Every year, nothing would come about, until he finally found that there were millions of cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So meaning if I were to take my brain out right now, there would be millions of cannabinoid receptors. And so he discussed this with other Israeli scientists. And the anthropologist says, well, maybe our ancestors were really smoking a lot of marijuana, and that's the evolutionary purpose to all these cannabinoid receptors. And for some reason, that didn't hit the professor, the scientist, the Israeli scientist too hard. He was like, that just doesn't sound right. Then came the neurologist, which is fascinating. And he said that the reason we have millions of cannabinoid receptors is because our body, as an organism itself, produces this cannabinoid-like effect in a natural form, almost as a mood stabilizer. And this was very possible at the time because it kind of goes with what we've talked about in past videos on how our body is the most sophisticated machine that exists. And when we're in a good state of mind, it naturally produces happy chemicals. And we can make our bodies feel whichever way we want. It's just the drug is almost like a cheat code into access into these feelings. So next time you are thinking about cannabis, recognize that you naturally produce this type of euphoric feeling within yourself without realizing it in an unconscious form. Naturally, as a mood stabilizer sometimes. You don't need the drug itself. The drug just strictly enhances it. It's almost like a cheat code you put in. So when we intake cannabis, why does it hit us so hard at the moment? It's not like taking a shot of alcohol where we ingest it and we might have to wait 30 to 45 minutes just to feel a little bit of effect. With cannabis, as soon as we smoke it and inhale it, it crosses the blood-brain region, making us directly influenced by the drug. And now we're realizing that, yes, there aren't too much long-term effects regarding cannabis use. There might not be a physical dependency involved. This is all very true. But there's a lot of research showing some of the negative side effects about cannabis. And like I mentioned earlier, with some of the destigmatization that's happening, there's a lot of new stigmas that are surrounding cannabis regarding cannabis use. There has been a lot of research done on cannabis, especially over the last 30 to 40 years. And now with the recent uptake and them legalizing it here in the United States, research has really elevated its game. Now, cannabis use is tied directly with testicular cancer. The more a male uses cannabis, the drug, especially in these high marijuana concentrations. Remember, marijuana is a plant with 0.3% or higher, and through deliberate evolutionary modifications, let's say by human beings, some marijuana plants as high as 30% marijuana levels. What does that mean? That means that the marijuana that was being used for spiritual purposes thousands of years ago is nothing compared to the marijuana in today's age. Just one hit of marijuana from today in any smoke shop is probably about 10 hits compared to back then. So it's important to know the difference that today's cannabis plants are way stronger than they were back then. So with that being said, recent studies have shown a link between male consumption of cannabis and testicular cancer. So there's one already, that's one fact that doesn't really get talked about too often. Marijuana smokers tend to inhale deeply, which really affects the lungs in a negative rate, especially heavy marijuana users, because if you're smoking a cigarette or a tobacco, a lot of times you're putting the smoke in, but you're just letting it out right here. But marijuana smokers, they're really ingesting it into their lungs, which really speeds up the process for lung cancer, and this has been shown oftentimes. Teens that use cannabis, they tend to struggle in school, and as a matter of fact, the dropout rates increase by almost twice as much with those adolescents that are using cannabis compared to or not. Especially when our brains, right, guys, our brain is growing through the developmental stages of life. We know that the brain continues to grow until the age of 26. Doesn't mean that we can't create new neurological connections or we can't learn anything new. But the main portion as to our potential, our ceiling, sometimes can be reached until 26. So if we're constantly ingesting cannabis, then it's affecting our brain growth in a variety of ways. Guys, study findings have shown that individuals who use marijuana heavily in their teens and continue to do so into their young adulthood have a huge drop in IQ of about 8 points. Now, obviously, these are longitudinal studies that have been done, and it's not for certain. Just because someone's smoking cannabis, that doesn't mean their IQ is going to drop. But what the research is saying, that in these longitudinal studies, meaning five or more years, they're finding that the user who's heavily using cannabis multiple times a day tend to have a drop-off in IQ. Now, why is this important? Someone uses cannabis, they have memory difficulties, problems concentrating, and poor sense of time. And so when these things, all these three things intertwine with one another, then all of a sudden the person is less inclined to remember things that they're learning. And if they can't learn new information, then how can they apply new information to their life so they grow, right? And they can build those necessary neurological connections. It's pleasure, memory, thinking, concentration, movement, coordination, sensory, and I believe time perception. And these are important components in the human experience. So when we smoke cannabis, all these sensors are being affected. And when we're trying to complete a task, then in these 6 time perception, coordination, thinking, the way we're processing information, if we can't even retain new information and we're trying to learn a new task, it's not going to work. So it's important to understand that marijuana, it's almost like it directly affects the hippocampus section of the brain, which, as you've known in previous videos, that the hippocampus is responsible. It's not that it's responsible, but directly is correlated with memory and the retention of new information. So people who have taken larger doses of marijuana, of the drug, may experience an acute effect of a term that we have used before on our podcast called psychosis, which includes hallucinations, delusions, and loss of sense and personal identity. Now, you can already see the loss of personal identity, how big this can have. I'm not sure if you guys have ever tried cannabis, but if you use too much, it could definitely make you start questioning yourself and the identities. Not saying that that's a bad thing per se, but when we start questioning our own identities that we've created over time, then in an unnatural form, by consuming an outside drug that's affecting our brain, it's making us think twice about who we are, and it's not coming intrinsically, this could cause all types of disruptions in our relationships, in the way we go about our lives, whether it's in school and work or wherever the case is. Now, cannabis doesn't directly affect the nucleus accumbens region of the brain, which is the brain responsible for pleasure and reward, but it can in a secondary effect. I may find, since my thinking, my coordination, my time perception, and just my senses are off, I may find something a little bit funnier. And in finding something funny, then that nucleus accumbens can act in a certain way where it's releasing more dopamine or serotonin than it typically would. Now, these are the issues that involve with cannabis use, is that if your brain's growing and you're consuming cannabis, you're altering the way that your brain is going to grow in a natural form. You're altering it by putting in and creating an influx of certain chemical reactions in the brain that's going to definitely disrupt your way of thinking. So I guess we've gone a while with this video, and we're going to you guys asked us a few questions, we're going to answer. Is marijuana a gateway drug? I don't like seeing things like yes or no. I like seeing things to a degree, and it can be. It can be a gateway drug, but so can tobacco and alcohol. So can your mom's pills in the cabinet. So it can be a gateway drug. How does marijuana use affect school, work, and social life? I think that was a question by one of the audience members. We already talked about that. If you can't retain new information, if your senses are going to be not operating at its optimal form, your sense of time is going to be off, your coordination, your movement, then obviously all the aspects in your life are going to be affected. And if your brain's growing and you're already going through the stages of puberty, or you have a lot going on, the consumption of marijuana and the influx of chemicals that it's causing in your brain, that in an unnatural form, remember, because it's an outside drug hitting inside the body, then all of a sudden your reaction to things may not be the same, affecting your relationships and schoolwork. Is there a link between marijuana use and psychiatric disorders? And I will say yes. And I really suggest you check out our podcast episode with Dr. Bridge, because he's a psychiatrist. He dove deep into this subject, and it's a tougher question than just on this video, but yes, it can. Is marijuana addictive? Now, marijuana can be addictive, but it's more of a mental addiction. It's not a physical addiction. It's not like if someone's been smoking marijuana for a week straight after school, let's say, then all of a sudden their mind may crave the marijuana. They may think that without the marijuana they're not going to be happy, but it's not true. It's actually just a mental component. It's the mind tricking itself to make you believe that it needs marijuana to function. So there is an addictive mental component to it. And the craziest part about it is, guys, is that we always think we are not influenced by our own mind, but we are. It'll create these narratives that you wouldn't even believe. And it's not till after the fact that you go through this narrative and this feeling and you push it to the side and you push through, when you have some resilience to do what you have to do, that you can look back and say, wow, I was really tricking myself. I was really fooling myself there. Let me see some of the other questions you guys had. Is marijuana a safe and effective medicine? Yes, marijuana is a safe and effective medicine, but only when prescribed by a medical doctor, a real medical doctor. And I think that's something that's happening nowadays with the marijuana industry. And we have social media now, and anybody can make a profile saying that they're anybody. And so they're throwing out words like anxiety, people that never even studied it. They're throwing out words like depression. They're throwing out words and talking about disorders that are clinical terms provided by clinical professions. And they're telling people, oh, you're struggling with anxiety, when really they have no practice in it. And so what's scary about that is when these people start giving therapeutic advice or using these terms in an absolute manner when they have no experience or qualifications to do so. So with that being said, marijuana can have medicinal purposes, but only if prescribed by a medical doctor. And if you think that you're struggling with the symptoms of anxiety, glaucoma, or whatnot, you need to go see a specialist that specializes in that and that can prescribe you the medicine. They can't just say, you just can't say, I'm struggling with anxiety, let me smoke pot. And most of the time I have found that those that say when they smoke pot to relax, of course, right? To gain this equilibrium within themselves, the moment you take away marijuana from them, they become very violent. And they don't have marijuana, all of a sudden their character changes. So I'm very peaceful when I have my marijuana. But you don't need marijuana to be peaceful. So the type of logic, so there has been a lot of destigmatizations about marijuana. When you smoke it, you're not going to go and kill somebody. But when you smoke it, you are affecting your brain. You are affecting your behavior. You are in an inadvertent manner affecting the relationships in your life. And marijuana, I don't want my doctor operating in the surgery room while on marijuana. I don't care what he says. I don't want it. I don't want my therapist using marijuana. I don't want the person driving my taxi using marijuana. Why? Because I'm putting my life at risk. I just don't want it, and no right person is going to want that. Whatever someone does in their spare time, it's on them. But marijuana is associated with a lot of negative effects in the long term. Maybe at that moment you may not hurt anybody, but you're definitely hindering yourself on your goals when using it. And that's Psych Lifers. So what's up, guys? So for our final words, we're going to share some final words as to what we think about cannabis. And we're not blind to the fact that cannabis has definitely been politicized, especially here in the United States. And the main people that started the prohibition against cannabis were misinformed politicians. But guess who was right up on the forefront in prohibiting cannabis use? And that was the alcohol companies. And still to this day, alcohol companies, such as the owner of Budweiser, are at the forefront of the anti-cannabis campaign. And just to add a little note to that, we all know that the pharmaceutical industry is very, very, very hostile towards cannabis. You know, the pharmaceutical industry, they say it's worth $500 million. It's a $500 million industry a year, guys, a year. And it's increasing, and it's been increasing around the world, because what happens is that the U.S. medical system is set up in a way where the doctor only sees a patient for an average of 9 to 10 minutes. And care revolves around the extinction of symptoms, or the repression of symptoms is actually a better word. Not extinction, but repression. The healthcare system in the U.S. is involved in the repression of symptoms. So meaning, if someone goes to the urgent care, let's say, and they have a huge pain in their stomach, they may run an x-ray, but at the end, they're just going to give you some medication, and you're off you go. And when the medication runs out, you come back, and they'll keep giving you medication. So yes, the symptom, the pain, is repressed, but the problem is still there. The medication doesn't cure anything. It just temporarily represses the symptom until the drug wears off in the brain. And so since our healthcare system is set up like this, and it's beginning to get set up like this around the world, a lot of people are rebelling and speaking out and saying, hey, this is not the right way for care. Where, well, it's set up like this in part because not only are there not enough doctors, and we must take that into account, and nurses and healthcare professionals, but the pharmaceutical industry has a strong grasp, and they'll never admit it. But doctors don't necessarily get paid to prescribe directly a certain drug unless it's under the table, but they do get quotas depending on the hospital as to what specific medication needs to be prescribed at some specific amount. And that'll be the hospital doing that, the directors. And cannabis, the reason the pharmaceutical industry is hostile towards cannabis is because they're kind of, by them being themselves, is putting a stop to all this. Why would someone need to pay these huge amounts of money for a specific medication, let's say like Percocet, when cannabis, a natural herb, can do just about the same thing depending on the situation, of course. Obviously, if someone's in tremendous pain, the oxycodone, the Percocet itself may be a little bit better for that situation. But overall, cannabis can relieve pain and reduce symptoms just as well as and help people sleep, depending if they're struggling with insomnia or not, just as good as any other medication sometimes. And this can cause a big problem for the pharmaceutical industry. So you're probably wondering, what do we think about it? What does Psych Life think about cannabis? And obviously, I've got a lot of pushback on some of my posts this week so far, and I get it. Some of you guys have identified with using cannabis. Some of you guys have identified your whole self-image around the use, whether you realize it or not. But I think cannabis should be legal. I heavily believe cannabis should be legal. And we are not, Psych Life is not promoting the use of cannabis in any way, because at the end of the day, it is a drug. But it should be legalized, and I don't think people should be incriminated for cannabis use. We also don't think that cannabis is completely safe 100% of the time neither. If I'm an individual and I'm using cannabis 3 times a day, morning, for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, then I really need to take a look in the mirror, because I'm abusing cannabis. Unless I have some sort of medical diagnosis such as glaucoma, or I was actually prescribed a medication, then that's fine. But you see, what happens is that people oftentimes get it confused, and they think that using cannabis 3 times a day is typical, because they say that they're struggling with the symptoms of anxiety. And the first thing I ask people when this happens is, were they diagnosed with anxiety by a medical professional, a healthcare professional, someone like myself? If they were not diagnosed with anxiety, then they can't diagnose themselves. Anxiety is a clinical term. Then I'll ask people how much they're using in cannabis. And if they tell me they're smoking 3 joints or 2 grams a day, that's way too much. Even people that get prescribed medically by professionals, doctors, they're only getting prescribed maybe like about 0.3 or 0.4 of cannabis a day. They're not smoking these huge amounts. And so understand this, if there's anything you're going to understand from this video, is that every drug serves its purpose, just in different dosages, how you use it, why you're using it, and when you're using it. If you're struggling with sleep and you're taking a hit of cannabis at nighttime, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably beneficial because studies have shown that's going to help you sleep. But if you're smoking a joint, 3 joints a day, and you're trying to make progress in your life, that's probably not the best course of action. And I'm going to be honest right now. If I have a doctor who's operating in the surgery room, I do not want that doctor to be high on cannabis. If I have a taxi driver that's driving me long distance, I do not want that taxi driver to be high on cannabis. And that's the honest truth. So psych lifers out there, don't polarize subjects as good or bad. Everything depends. Everything has its purpose. And I think the worst thing we can do is polarize subjects. So obviously this is a message from us to you guys. And we hope you enjoy this message and this video. And take care.